Hello everybody, my name is Spyros Heniadis and this is where I answer your photography questions and we learn about photography together. Today we are continuing with our video series on dynamic range. And from the first video in our series, we know what dynamic range is. Now what we're going to talk about is how to use that information when we are taking photographs. There are two keys to using this information. The first key is understanding what the photo is going to look like when we choose settings to take a photo. The second thing is understanding what you can do with that photo to realize the vision that inspired you to take that photo in the first place. This is the kind of technique that Ansel Adams used when he took all of his photographs. His process started with visualizing in his head what the final printed photograph was going to look like. Now, Adams understood that more often than not, the vision he had in his head of the final photograph was impossible to capture with the camera. What I mean by this is that Adams realized that the camera is a tool and is only one tool in the entire image making process. Knowing the limitations of his camera, Adams would deliberately choose his settings to capture a photograph that would retain the maximum amount of information possible for that scene that he was photographing. Then he would take that photo, in this case a film negative, into the darkroom and he would manipulate that photo in order to realize the vision that he had of the final photograph. Now, instead of film and chemicals and darkrooms, we use raw image files and image editing software like Adobe Photoshop or Lightroom or Apple's Aperture. But the process of deliberately taking a photograph in order to manipulate it to match the vision that inspired that photo is a perfectly valid process. And knowing what we know about dynamic range allows us to capture a photograph that has the maximum amount of information possible so that we can use that information to create the photo that we want, but this changes how we think about and how we approach taking photographs. Because there is a natural expectation when we walk up to a scene that we want to photograph that what we see with our eyes, we should be able to capture with the camera. But that expectation is wrong because our eyes have a dynamic range of around 20 stops. And if you remember from the first video, most cameras have a dynamic range of around 10 to 12 stops. And with a dynamic range nearly twice that of digital cameras, what we see with our eyes is very different from what the camera might be capable of capturing. Now, this photo looks nothing like what my eyes saw when I was looking at the scene. What I saw with my eyes looked more like this right here. And when I took this original photo, I knew it wasn't going to look like what I was seeing with my eyes or the vision of the final photo that I had in my head. This is the vision that I had in my head. This is the exact same photo. The only difference is that I have taken the time to use Adobe Lightroom, manipulate the information in that image to make it look like the vision I had in my head. So when you see the photo that I took right here, next to the edited version of that same photo, they look totally different. And I knew that the original photo wasn't going to look the way that I wanted it to look when it came out of the camera. But that's fine because the goal wasn't to make it look the way I wanted it to look. The goal was to capture the information I needed, and that means I wanted to capture as much of the dynamic range of the scene as possible. I wanted information in the brightest area of the photo and information in the darkest area of the photo without either one of them being overexposed or underexposed. And at first glance, as we look at this photo, it looks like the darkest area is underexposed, and it looks like the very brightest area of the sky is also overexposed. And so looking at it, it looks like I failed to capture the dynamic range that I wanted. What we're looking at here is the sky area of the photo at 100% magnification. And if you look in the upper right-hand corner of the screen, you see the histogram. And underneath the histogram, there are three percentages. Those percentages read R 96%, G 95.9%, and B 94.8%. The R, G, and B stand for red, green, and blue. And those percentages tell us how much of each one of those colors are being mixed together to create the color in the sampled area of the image. Now, to our eyes, the area that is sampled here and most of the area around it looks almost completely white and overexposed, as if it would have no color or detail information in it. And if those percentages read 100% red, 100% green, and 100% blue, it would be overexposed. But at 96, 95.9, and 94.8%, it's very close, but it is not overexposed. There is still color and detail information in that area. That's information that I can use when I edit the photo. If we look at the darkest area, we can see the same thing. Here's a 100% zoom of the shadow area, which looks underexposed, but the percentages of the sample area are 3.2%, 2.6%, and 2.1%. And again, it's very close to being completely black, which would be 0%, 0%, and 0%, but it's not. So even though the original photo is not very much of a photo, it is the photo that I wanted and needed to take to realize the vision of the photo that I had in my head. Now in next week's video, I'll show you exactly what I did in Lightroom to take the original photo and turn it into the edited version that you see right here. And you'll be shocked at just how easy it was for me to do this. But what I want to talk about now is how I decided to take this photo in this way so that I could use Lightroom to create the photo that I created. When I approached this scene, what originally attracted me was the sunset. I wanted to preserve the colors and the details of this really nice looking sunset. But I also really like this building in the image. And I also like the fact that with my fisheye lens, it created this really strong line that swoops into the image and pulls you into the sunset area of the scene. And I wanted detail and color information in the building and in the sky in the sunset area. I knew that if I exposed only for the sky to capture the colors and the details of the sunset, that I would lose the building into very heavy shadows, which would eliminate the building having detail and color the way I wanted it to for my final photograph. Basically, I knew that by exposing for the sky, the scene would exceed the dynamic range of my camera. And this is where people get tripped up with dynamic range. Because when we capture a photo that captures the maximum amount of dynamic range possible for the camera, there are going to be areas in the image that are very dark and very bright. But if you take a photo and you choose your exposure settings for the brightest thing in the image, like the sky in this photo that we've been looking at today, you can easily push the dynamic range of the scene outside of the capabilities of your camera. And this happens because of how the digital image file is recorded. See, in the photograph that your camera creates, the image file, whether it's a RAW file or a JPEG file, regardless of the dynamic range capabilities of the camera you are using, the maximum dynamic range of the image is from black to white. Remember the percentages that we were looking at before. 0%, 0%, and 0% would be pure black, no color and no detail information at all. And 100%, 100%, 100% would be pure white with no color or detail information in there. And what this means is that the dynamic range of the image that is produced by the camera is a fixed range from pure black to pure white. It doesn't matter what the dynamic range of your camera is, it's going to be displayed in your photograph as pure black to pure white. So when you capture a photograph that has a high dynamic range, your photo should look something like this. It should have very bright areas, near 100%, and it should have very dark areas near 0%. So when you expose for the brightest area of the image, that changes the way the camera records that area. It's still going to be the brightest part of your photograph, but it's not necessarily going to be around 100% bright. If we go back to the original photo, the brightest area of the image is at 96%, 95.9%, and 94.8%. Now I've got another photo here that I took at almost the exact same time as I took the photo we've been looking at. And in this shot, I exposed specifically for the sky, ignoring the rest of the image. In this photo, the sky is still the brightest part of the image, but it is no longer near 100%. The percentages in the same area of the sky are significantly lower at 84%, 85.3%, and 85.8%. Just because I changed my exposure doesn't mean that it changed how bright the sky was relative to how dark the entryway of the building was. And if the brightest area of the image is recorded as less bright, then the darkest area of the image is going to be recorded less bright as well, or more dark. And if we look at the dark areas, we're going to see a similar reduction in the percentage. In the first image, we were at around 3%, but if we zoom into 100% on this image here, we're going to see the darkest area is now reading at 0.4, 0.3, and 0.4%. That is almost entirely and completely black with no color and no detail information. And if I take this photo where the sky is decently exposed at 85% brightness, and I try to manipulate it in the same way that I manipulated the photo we were looking at earlier, I can't get the vision in my head out of this photo. There is not enough information here. You can see it right here. This is the edited version of that photo, and I can't make it look the way I wanted it to look. By making the brightest area of the image less bright, I made the darkest area of the image so dark that I didn't have enough information to work with. And the same thing happens in reverse if you expose for the darkest part of the image. Here's another example photo, and this one I exposed for the entryway area. And if we zoom in at 100%, you can see we have readings of 40.3, 37.1, and 32.5%. That is much brighter than the roughly 3% readings we were getting in the first photo. And then if we look at the sky, we can see that it has gone right off the charts with readings of 100%, 100%, and 100%. There's no information in this part of the sky here, nothing that I can use to manipulate and make the image look the way that I want it to look. So what does all this mean? It essentially means that you have two choices, two ways you can approach taking a photograph. First, you can expose for the most important thing in your image, knowing that when doing that, you might lose detail in the brightest or darkest areas of your image, depending upon the dynamic range of the scene. An example of this is Greg's photo, which I critiqued last week. He chose to expose for the sunset and capture the amazing and beautiful colors in that sunset, and as a result, the foreground fell into very dark, very heavy shadow. And I want to be clear that doing this is not a right or a wrong choice. It's a matter of whether or not the final photograph matches the vision of the photo that you have in your head. And I also want to be clear that having dark shadows or bright highlight areas in your photograph is not a bad thing. In many cases, it can be a very good thing. An example of a photo like that is right here. I've got this photograph of this flower, and in the background, I have very dark shadow areas. I chose to expose for the photograph, knowing that the background was going to fall in a very dark, heavy shadow. And I wanted that because I wanted that dark, heavy shadow to allow the flower to stand out against that background. But if making that choice does not allow you to realize your vision, then you can take a different approach. To do that, instead of exposing for the most important thing in your image, you expose so that the brightest part of the image is almost but not quite overexposed. This will ensure that you have usable detail in the brightest part of the resulting photograph. And if the scene does not exceed the dynamic range capabilities of your camera, then you will also have usable detail in the darkest part of the resulting photograph. Keep in mind that if the scene you are photographing exceeds the dynamic range of your camera, then this technique isn't going to work. Because if the scene has a dynamic range of 30 stops, when you expose your highlights to the point that they are almost overexposed, the darkest area of the scene will still be outside of the 10 to 12 stop dynamic range capability of your camera. In situations like this, another option is HDR photography, which is something I am going to be covering as part of this series on dynamic range. So that's all I've got for you guys this week. Do me a favor, if you have any questions about this dynamic range stuff, let me know down in the comments. You can also head over to my website, selfhelpphotographer.com, and get subscribed to my email list where you can actually send me an email question. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and most importantly, you guys know what to do. Get out there, take some damn photos. I'll see you guys next week. I've exceeded my dynamic range!